Good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the College of Law. My name is Josh Favel. I'm a professor here, and I'm from Poundmaker Cree Nation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the college, and for those of you joining us on the live stream, a warm welcome as well. We're delighted that so many of you could attend today for this special afternoon event, and we really thank you for your attendance. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional territory of Treaty 6 and the ancestral homeland of the Métis people. In honoring this land's rich history, we pay our utmost respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors who have shaped this place, and in so doing, we reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'd like to express our gratitude to McKercher LLP, whose generous donations and sponsorship enable our college to host these lectures. These lectures enrich the mind of our students and everyone here that is attending. I'd also like to thank our guest speaker, Cadmus Delorme, for joining us here today. I know you're taking time out of your busy schedule to share your knowledge and expertise with us, and we really appreciate it. And we welcome you to the college as well. Cadmus Delorme is a renowned Indigenous leader and former chief of the Cowessess First Nation. During his time as chief, he prioritized political sovereignty, economic self-sustainability, and cultural revival. Cadmus Delorme's work extended beyond the borders of Cowessess First Nation, as he was an advocate for Indigenous rights and reconciliation on a national scale. His commitment to truth and reconciliation, Indigenous sovereignty, and economic empowerment has made him a respected figure among leaders in Canada. Mr. Delorme's leadership and dedication to his community have earned him a national profile, and he works as an inspiration to many in the ongoing effort to improve the lives of Indigenous people and promote meaningful reconciliation in Canada. He's a CBC Saskatchewan 40 Future Awardee, recognized for his leadership, and is now a partner at Flowing River Capital Group, dedicated to advancing truth and reconciliation, specifically focusing on Call to Action 92. And without further ado, I hand it over to Mr. Delorme.
Thank you very much. Nanaskamun, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here in Treaty 6 territory. I left Cowessess this morning at 7:30 a.m. Cowessess is in southeast Saskatchewan. I'd point with my lips, but I'd point too far in the direction I live. Got here just in time. About 6 months ago, the U of S reached out to me and asked if I would come and share. I was just finishing my chief second term, and I had so much up here I just needed to release. I'm like, absolutely, I'll come to the University of Saskatchewan, and here I am today. Just one confession, I'm a very proud University of Regina alumni. I just wanted to throw that out there. And with it comes the First Nations University of Canada. Today my presentation is about storytelling. In order to understand child welfare reform, we have to understand Indigenous worldview. And to understand Indigenous worldview, we must look at it from a lens of Indigenous. Anything in Indigenous is about storytelling. It's about journeys. It's about learned lessons. And so my presentation today is going to be that. I'm 41 years old. I look young. That's that reserve water I get to shower in every day. Why I look so young. I was elected chief of the Cowessess First Nation at an age of 34 years old. And I was chief for 2 terms. I was elected in 2016 and again in 2019. And in April of 2023, my wife and I decided I'll take a break. And absolutely love my journey as a chief. At my kitchen table growing up on my First Nation, I had 2 living witnesses sitting at my kitchen table of residential school. Both my parents attended, I never attended. My parents always raised me around our kitchen table with funny stories, with ambition, with curiosity, and an eagerness to just find a good means in life. When I was growing up on my kitchen table, I remember at Cowessess Community Education Center, that's where I graduated in grade 12. I was in grade 11. And when you grow up on a reserve, you get the same classmates throughout your whole journey. It's just, you only date the one person you're not related to, and it usually ends at grade 10, so you're snagging elsewhere after that. But in grade 11, this young man showed up in our class about a quarter into our school year. And he just showed up one day in school and come to class with us. And, of course, we welcomed him in. We played sports, went out in the back and, just in class. And he only was there for 2 months. And I could just tell when I met this young man that he had such an interesting life. And his kitchen table was probably not the same as mine. With 2 parents, very funny, good meal every evening. And then he left. Just one day he stopped showing up. And I was asking, well, where did he go? And they're like, oh, he was a foster kid. And I'm like, well, what's a foster kid? And it was my first ever encounter knowing, of children in care at, such a level of someone that really impacted me, because I really got to know this young man. But I knew he was, if I can say lack of terms, in for an interesting life just because of the way his mind and his spirit was. But he was so nice and foundationally there. But, and as I got older, I came across this individual a few times. We're still friends today. But, I was thinking of it. I'm like, wow, like that was in the 90s. And I eventually graduated from my community education center with a grade 12 diploma. I had one goal at the time. It was to look like Eminem Marshall Mathers. So if anybody stalks me on social media, I did a pretty good job. And if you look closely and you know the music from that time, I even cut my hair like Cisco, if you remember who Cisco was. I eventually made my way to First Nations University of Canada. When I got there to a university, I took an Indigenous studies class. And I grew up on my First Nation. I grew up around a very loving, funny family. We weren't money rich, we were just love rich. And when I took an Indigenous studies class, I'm a Generation Y. We didn't have Indigenous studies or Native studies. We had social studies. And when I got to university, I'm like, they have a class called Indigenous studies? I was like, I could probably teach this class, I was thinking to myself. And I took it, and the professor came in, did her syllabus, did the orientation, and she stood up front like this and started talking. It was my first ever experience hearing about what a residential school was. I grew up on my First Nation. I grew up around a kitchen table with living witnesses. I grew up in a First Nation that housed a residential school from 1898 to 1996. No one ever talked about it. It was just something you just didn't talk about. When I was sitting in class, I'm like, what do you mean my parents went through this? What do you mean Indigenous people? It was my first time realizing that we have a history here together. And I eventually graduated from First Nations University of Canada with a business degree, but I walked out of that institution with this awoken Indigenous worldview spirit of understanding. And I kind of knew I wanted to be a chief at the time, but I realized we all live in 2 worldviews. And it's really important to understand the 2 worldviews. The one worldview is Indigenous worldview. Indigenous people, we've lived it since time immemorial. Pre-1867, there was no children in care, no unemployment. Indigenous people of that time had a good ecosystem. There was an economics, there was an education. There was everything that was needed, and it was brought from generations before that. Indigenous people from 1867 to today, 2023, we still live this Indigenous worldview, and we've always wanted to welcome in Canadians into our Indigenous worldview. Now, moving forward, we got to understand more of that Indigenous worldview. And I knew that, but I didn't know the Canadian Western worldview. I grew up centric around Indigenous people. And so I got my master's at a school called the Johnson-Shiama School of Public Policy. An amazing school. It's here in the U of S. It's also at the U of R. And I'm not saying it's Western worldview based, but it's very foundationally built in understanding that. And I got my master's in that. And I understood both worldviews. Then I became elected chief. In 2018, I was sitting at a grandmother's house on Cowessess. She called me. She's like, can you come over, Chief? I need to tell you something. So we went over. I went over. We broke some bannock, had some tea. And she started to tell me about her granddaughter in the ministry system. And I listened, as a leader should, and we do. And then I told her, did you know Indigenous people have an inherent right to raising our children? And I started to explain to her. And finally she said, well, Chief, go out and do it. I'm like, okay, I got my mandate. And, I started this journey. And it was a Cowessess journey. It took us about 6 months as council. In Indigenous governance, you elect a chief and council. As a chief, I'm not a premier, I'm not a prime minister, I'm not a CEO, I'm a chief. And I take my direction by the 8 elected councillors under our governance that are elected as well. So it took us about 6 months around our council table to understand what this meant. And then we started to engage with the community, the nation people, the citizens, the members. And after a while, we started to mold something. At that point, we realized we were about to embark on a journey that was going to help us control our destiny. And one of the things about being a chief today in 2023 is every chief goes through this. 75% of our time is managing poverty. 25% is innovation and economics. 75% of a chief's time is managing mental, emotional, physical, spiritual poverty. I'm not just talking monetary poverty. And that's our role. And so that 25%, whatever time in the day you have, we try our best to focus on that. And as we are starting to gain strength, I started to realize what the biggest challenge was for Indigenous people to understand child welfare reform, is to understand the history that we have with Canadians. The biggest challenge I found to reconciliation when it comes to child welfare reform is to understand what we all just inherited. As Canadians and Indigenous people today, nobody in this room, nobody in this province, nobody in this country today created what we know as residential schools, the 60s scoop. We all inherited this moment. And as Indigenous people and Canadians, when we inherit something together, we have a responsibility to do something about it. I realized at one moment on this journey that we could not do this without both worldviews just calming down a little bit. Because right now, we come into a lot of these understandings, a lot of optimism, and we just get to those meetings and we start talking about strategy, and then we implement it, and then we fail. Sometimes we got to just pause and realize, are we actually starting at step 3 and not step 1? Step 1 is understanding jurisdiction, where it is now and where it needs to be to reform it. And so once you understand jurisdiction, the second step is institutions. What institutions are going to foundationally support this? Then you move to strategy. And so one of the things that we got to understand is truth. It took a lot of our energy to just focus on truth. And there's 2 things about truth in this country that we got to understand, is we all inherited something today. I want to show you a couple things on the PowerPoint behind me that relates to truth. And I just want to say that we have to understand truth first before we move to reconciliation. Many of us go right to reconciliation and we just want it to happen because we're a tangible results society today. And we realize we skip truth. Once we understand truth and acknowledge it, reconciliation comes with so much more optimism and hope. And reconciliation can only happen with uncomfortable conversations. We all have to just admit we're about to have an uncomfortable conversation. Let's start with truth. I want to show you a couple things that are happening in this country in the last 2 generations. Let's just assess where we are with truth today. This is a statue of our first prime minister in our country, John A. Macdonald. Right now, institutions and cities have a tough decision to make about removal or not remove a statue. Some people in Canada take a position, and they'll let it be known. Many Canadians will stand on the side and say, I don't have a comment, but what is a statue going to help with reconciliation? Indigenous people, many are screaming inside. I just want to share with you a quote that John A. Macdonald said in the House of Commons in 1879. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and mode of thought are an Indian. He is simply a savage who could read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself as head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from their parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they'll acquire the habits and modes and thought of white men, unquote. Remember, we inherited this moment. But as Canadians, sometimes our own country was very triggering, and we see the results today. I talk to you about this, not to try and debate with you, but to educate you. Let's make sure we're asking the right questions when we come to the table together to reform child welfare. Right now, in our neighboring province, they have one of the toughest conversations happening right now, the landfill. Many Canadians are just watching right now. And some political parties even use this to try and get politics into it. Right now, Indigenous people, and especially Indigenous females, they're seeking honor and dignity in this country. The toughest person to be in this country today is an Indigenous female. And just read the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Calls to Justice if you want to learn more. I'm just assessing what we all inherited today. In the Mi'kmaq on the East Coast, a jurisdiction issue erupted in 2019. This is what happened. 4 fishing boats went out into the ocean in 2019. And these Mi'kmaq boats were out there exercising their inherent rights to sustain their way of life. Non-Indigenous people started protesting on the shores. Get those boats out of the water. There's legislation. They can't be fishing right now. This is fairness. They follow it and we follow it. They're not special. Created this protest. A boat was vandalized. A warehouse burnt down. One of the things we got to understand together is that Indigenous people in this country are rights holders. Indigenous people are not shareholders, not stakeholders, rights holders. And once we understand that, our social and economic impact together will lift. This instant was about a treaty in 1752 when the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq and the ancestors of Britain/pre-Canadians agreed that the Mi'kmaq can always sustain their way of life. But as Canadians, we never really heard about things like this before. Sometimes we take positions too quick to understand that Indigenous people are rights holders. In 1990, something in this country happened today that we know as Oka. In 1990, this little town in Quebec was about to build a back 9 golf course to match their front 9 golf course. And the town of Oka checkmarked the municipal bylaws, the provincial and federal guidelines, and they brought in the bulldozers. The Mohawks, the rights holders, were standing there and said, nobody come and consulted with us. You can't dig here. We have ancestral burial grounds. The town of Oka said, get off the way. We did our due diligence. It created this standoff in this country. The only time in our history, our military were called in to protect a certain people. I was too young to remember, but it was one of the most racial tension times in the last 2 generations between Indigenous people and Canadians. Oka didn't have to happen. This is a picture of Cowessess First Nation. Behind those solar lights used to stand a 5-story residential school. In 2021, one of my toughest duties is I had to stand in front of cameras and explain why we had ground radar penetrating hits of unmarked graves. There's 2 things I learned about unmarked graves in this country today. For Indigenous people, unmarked graves is validation. It's validation of a pain, frustration, anger, tiredness of trying to remain Indigenous in a country that is still somewhat oppressive to that Indigenous worldview. To my amazing Canadian friends and family, since the unmarked graves, many have put their shield down and have admitted, maybe I should learn more about the truth between Indigenous people and Canadians. We got to understand when we're about to reform something in this country, we have to make sure that our patterns are not consistent. And one of the biggest challenges is truth. Here's a picture of me on a horse. In 2019, the town of Fort Qu'Appelle called me and said, "Chief, we're having a Treaty 4 parade. Can you bring your headdress, bring a horse, and look stoic for us?" "I'll do my best," I said. I was good going down Main Street till a balloon flew under my horse and he bucked, and I walked it in from there. I said, 200 years ago, I would have been a berry picker, I told him. I wouldn't have been going into raids. When you form something, we got to understand for Indigenous people, when you do child welfare, it's about relationship. It's about equal. It's about understanding and respecting roles and relationships. This is what was envisioned at Treaty 6 and Treaty 4 for relationship. I want to talk about hope and what it was supposed to be. Chief Cowessess was a senior citizen. Many First Nations in this province are named after the last male hereditary chief that was at treaty. Chief Cowessess was a senior citizen. He watched half of his family pass away because of the smallpox pandemic in 1860. His Indigenous worldview medicine could not keep up to this Western worldview disease. He watched the buffalo deplete to nothing in 1870. The only thing he was ever taught in his maternal and paternal lineage to protect his people was the buffalo. It housed food, shelter, clothing, medicine, depleted to nothing. He watched new Canadian settlers come to this land he's never seen before. He knew change was coming, but he didn't know what change meant. And at Treaty 4 in Fort Qu'Appelle, under the tent of Alexander Morris, the commissioner on behalf of Queen Victoria, he sat there and he was just observing all of the Crown's representatives. And everybody kept walking up to this one person, and they'd ask a question, and then they'd walk away. Finally, Chief Cowessess asked the interpreter, because he only spoke the Indigenous languages, "Who's that person? Why do they keep going to that person?" And the interpreter said, "That's a lawyer." And then Chief Cowessess said, "What's a lawyer?" And the interpreter said, he went to school to read books. He went to school to interpret the law. He went to school to protect and enhance the laws in this country. And this is what Chief Cowessess said. "If I agree to this treaty, can you help my children be like him, but always make sure they remain like me?" The interpreter went and talked to the commissioner. The commissioner came back in front of Chief Cowessess, and the commissioner did not speak an Indigenous language, so the interpreter was very vital. Commissioner told Chief Cowessess, "That's why we're doing this treaty with you. We want to help your children be like him, but always make sure they remain like you." 2 days later, Chief Cowessess touched the pen, validating this new relationship. Think of 2 canoes going down the river. I'm not trying to teach us the wampum treaty of my cousins to the east. That's a beautiful teaching. But think of 2 canoes going down the river. One canoe is the Indigenous worldview. The other canoe is Canadian Western worldview. At treaty, we were supposed to flow down the river together as long as the sun shines, grass grows, river flows. We were supposed to exchange the children in each other's canoe and raise those children to know the ideology, and we'll give them both back so we can always adapt our social and economic relationship together. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Right after Treaty 4, during Treaty 6, the Indian Act was thrown in the Indigenous worldview canoe. The Indian Act had one purpose: to imprison the minds of anybody in that Indigenous worldview. That whatever vertical lineage governance you had, it didn't matter. The Canadian Western worldview will micromanage your life from birth to death. And that Indigenous worldview canoe fell behind a little bit. After that, the residential school was thrown in that Indigenous worldview canoe. Residential schools had one purpose: to brainwash anybody in that Indigenous worldview canoe, that you didn't know your vertical lineage of mom, grandma, great-grandma, so forth. That the Western worldview will tell you how to pray, tell you how to speak, and that Indigenous worldview canoe fell behind even more. Today in 2023, that canoe just wants to catch up. It's not asking Canadians to slow down and wait for us. It's not trying to take a different river. It's not telling the Canadian canoe to go back to Europe. At least I'm not. Some people in my canoe say that. I'm like, well, that'll never happen. We just want to catch up while our Indigenous worldview isn't oppressed anymore. That's reconciliation. That's what we all just inherited. How does this relate to child welfare reform? There's one last thing I need to make sure I emphasize to get us to that strategic mind of child welfare reform. Is what is the biggest challenge of catching up those canoes? There's one more thing in truth that I need to explain to you. Is why did it take unmarked graves for many Canadians to put our shields down and admit, maybe I should learn more about the truth? There's a reason for this. I want to explain to you the Canadian education system and why we all inherited this moment and why it's so tough to understand. I want to start off with new Canadians. New Canadians in this country are needed more than ever. We're going to see the biggest increase in new Canadians since Confederation in the next 2 generations. New Canadians are going to help us sustain our economy, and plus internationally, we're a dreamer country. But when a new Canadian gets to our lands, what is the orientation they're given to explain the truth between Indigenous people and Canadians when they get here? This is what they're told. Do not go downtown after dark time. Many new Canadians get their truths from their new work Canadian colleagues, from what they see on TV, from what they see with their own eyes, and it's far from the truth. Now let's talk about generations in this country, generational Canadians, and why it's so tough for reconciliation. I'll start off with baby boomers. Baby boomers, some are retired, some are still working, many are our parents and grandparents if we're younger. Baby boomers ask one thing of us, that we look after them, and we're going to do our best. But when a baby boomer was in the Canadian education system, what did they learn in elementary or junior high school about the truth? They learned nothing. Baby boomers that went to a religious school were taught the opposite. Residential schools are saving the Indian. The only thing baby boomers learned was through Hollywood movies. The buckskin wearing, paint on the face, living in teepees, the game Cowboys and Indians. I pre-warn you, if we play Cowboys and Indians after and I'm playing, the Indians usually win. I'm just throwing it out there. Far from the truth. Generation X, the biggest decision-making generation in this university, in this province, and in this country. Generation X, through patience and perseverance and training, have made their way up to decision-making tables, and they earned it. But what did Generation X learn in our Canadian education system about the truth? This is what Generation X learned. There was something in 1969, the Indian solution to the Indian problem. Today we know it as the white paper. This was the mentality of the white paper. Indians, get over it. Quit trying to act special in this country. Leave the reserve. Give up your rights. Just be Canadian. If anybody thinks that's the solution, you're wasting your energy. That'll never happen. But that's what Generation X learned in our Canadian education system. Far from the truth. Generation Y. I'm a Generation Y. I went to a reserve school, and it was no different at the time. This is what we learned. Yes, treaties happened. But Indians, you surrendered the land. And the residential schools and the Indian Act, you agreed to that. Far from the truth. Today, our millennials have taken an Indigenous studies class, a Native studies class, and going to get more. They're getting it. Today, our Generation X or Z, exiting high school, Indigenous studies class, Native studies class, going to get more. They're getting it. This is the challenge we face as Canadians today. There's no mandatory Indigenous studies class coming to new Canadians, Generation Baby Boomer X or Y. We're the students in this moment. How do we talk about child welfare reform if we haven't even really assessed our compass deep down that it's tough for us to accept the truth now because we were taught something different? That's the challenge we face in empowering Indigenous worldview today. Remember, we inherited this moment. Nobody created it today. But when you inherit something, we all have a responsibility, Indigenous and not. If I had more than 50 minutes, I would focus more on the both sides, but I want to get to my child welfare reform presentation. But in order to explain to you, we first have to all understand that we're students in this journey. One of the things about child welfare reform is, where did Indigenous people tell the province, here's all our children in care, you look after them, okay? Please look after them. Because right now the ministry, jurisdictionally, will state they have jurisdiction to children in care. In 2018, I was sitting at our legislation building in Regina, and I was sitting with the then minister of the day, friend of mine, Minister Merriman. He was social services at the time minister. And we're sitting there, and I said, Minister, can you tell me where Cowessess told you, here's all our children in care, look after them? He looked at me and said, I don't know, Chief. I was like, Minister, did you know children are our inherent right as Indigenous people? And we never gave you that jurisdiction. I was like, Minister, let me tell you where you think you have that right. In 1492, I went real far back. In 1492, there was this game in Europe. Today we call it Doctrine of Discovery. These groups of European countries from a religious fictional law made an agreement that if you showed up to the shores of a land where those people didn't grow gardens the way Europe did, didn't have fences around their houses the way Europe did, didn't pray the way Europe did, they were not people, they were subjects, and you can conquer them. So Christopher Columbus showed up to this little island called Turks and Caicos in the Bahamas. Later, Cartier came down the Hudson, and they both put down these flags and said, we have underlying title. The ancestors of Indigenous people were standing there and like, nice flag. They didn't have to explain anything because they already made the agreement in Europe. Nobody consulted with Indigenous peoples when that happened. They just said, you're subjects and we conquered you. In 1821, in the United States of America, after the United States was a country for almost 50 years, the Cherokee took the United States of America to their Western worldview court because the United States was telling the Cherokee how to run their affairs. And there was a judge named Marshall, and he rendered 3 decisions. Today we know it as the Marshall Trilogy. This is what the Marshall Trilogy said in 1821. Yes, Cherokee, you're sovereign, but because of the religious doctrine of discovery, you are domestically sovereign under the United States of America. Nobody consulted with Indigenous people at that time. It was just Marshall Trilogy. Said, you're domestically sovereign under us. In 1888 in Canada, the St. Catharines milling case, the Ojibways were tired of Canada after 11 years telling them how to run their logging affairs. The Ojibways took the Dominion of Canada to the Western Worldview Court. The St. Catharines milling case said the following: yes, Ojibways, you're sovereign, but because of doctrine of discovery, we grandfather into Canada the Marshall Trilogy. You are domestically sovereign under the Dominion of Canada. Nobody come and consulted with Indigenous people at that time. They just told us that. So in 1867, when the British North American Act got here, they created Section 91 for federal jurisdiction. They created Section 92 in 1871 for provincial territorial jurisdiction. And they said, you know what, we're going to put Indians under Section 9124 here and make them a federal jurisdiction. Nobody come and asked us at that time. They just put us there. This is where Canada got it wrong at the beginning. They should have created Section 93, respecting and honoring Indigenous rights and jurisdiction. But they didn't. Without consent, they put us under Section 9124. That's why today, when we decolonize our minds, Indigenous people are not a federal responsibility. That's just where Canada put us without our consent. And so in 1876, Canada said, let's create this Indian Act. They didn't come to us and said, what do you think of the Indian Act? They just implemented it without any consultation. And so in 1951, the province of Saskatchewan took all Indigenous children in care because they said, we're going to take Section 88 of the Indian Act, and we have jurisdiction over all children in care now. Nobody in 1951 came to any Indigenous nation and said, what do you think if we take all your children in care? No. The province says, we have that jurisdictional right, and they took it. So in 2021, in the Cowessess Indigenous Worldview Canoe, we created our law called the Mio Pima Tisawin Act, striving for a better life. And we told the provinces and federal government, Awas, get out of our canoe. In Cree, Awas means get out. Awas, get out of our canoe. We have our own inherent right jurisdiction. And guess what? They awast. They got out. The thing Indigenous nations want today is to control our own destiny. That's what we need foundationally, is to control our own destiny. And we got to understand that our canoes align. That's child welfare reform. Right now, we do have some child welfare organizations that are doing well and some are struggling. You got the Saskatoon Tribal Council. You got Cubo. We got Yellow Thunderbird Lodge. These are operational jurisdiction. They're not jurisdiction on the whole foundation. And I'll give you an example. In 2016, the province of Saskatchewan, they decided to stop the relationship with the Saskatoon Tribal Council Child Welfare. It wasn't the STC that agreed to that. That's the control the ministry still has today. So a lot of these organizations today, they're administratively trying their best, but they're underfunded and they don't have the foundational jurisdiction. That's the challenge we face today. That is the short-term solution. But the long-term solution to child welfare reform, in a legal perspective, in a relationship long-term perspective, is we just gotta awas. Indigenous nations have these laws. We may not write them down today, but they're in our ceremonies, they're in our songs, and it's now up to Indigenous governing bodies to now write these laws down. That's how we adapt. We've adapted many times. And I give you an example. Indigenous people, The horse was introduced to us in 1790. We weren't always horse people. We were the river people. And then when the horse got introduced to us in 1790, it changed us. Today we're the plains people. We were able to hunt better and able to travel across long prairies. We've adapted. Now as Indigenous people, it's now up for us to adapt again. And we have to start writing down our laws. And it's happening. But it's still happening from sometimes a colonization perspective. And what is decolonization? When I was a chief, I stood up in a band meeting one time and I said, Cowessess people, we got to decolonize ourselves. I was like, oh my gosh, they're going to love it, I was thinking. The senior citizen stood up and said, Chief, don't bring those $10 university words around here. I'm like, oh my gosh. How do I explain decolonization? This is decolonization. I had a great-great-grandma. Her name was Gracie. She was born in 1874. She never attended a residential school. She later lived on the reserve, but she lived a pure Indigenous worldview life. And she lived just east of Regina. She had a strong vertical lineage, meaning that she was taught from her mom and aunties and grandma and 7 generations of emotional intelligence and beautiful Indigenous worldview. Gracie was pure. Gracie had my great-grandma Maggie. Because Maggie was born in 1900, and because there was a Canadian policy, Maggie had to attend a residential school. Maggie should have got her vertical lineage teachings from her mom and aunties and grandma and 7 generations, but Maggie didn't. Maggie had to go into horizontal survival mode with her sisters and cousins. Maggie had my grandma Evelyn, 2nd generation. Evelyn should have got beautiful vertical lineage teachings from her mom and auntie and 7 generations, but Evelyn didn't. Evelyn had to go into horizontal survival mode with her sisters and cousins. Evelyn had my mom Charlotte, born in 1949, when this country was good government and justice for all. Not Charlotte. Charlotte had to attend. Charlotte should have got beautiful vertical lineage teachings from her mom and auntie and 7 generations, but Charlotte didn't. Charlotte went into horizontal survival mode. Charlotte had me in 1982. When this country didn't believe in my mom raised me to still believe in this country. Today I'm very honored to share that my 7-year-old daughter and my mom, their relationship is inseparable. This is what decolonization means. We have to understand, Indigenous people today, we don't want pity. We don't want anybody to feel sorry for us. We want parity. Like every other Canadian, while our Indigenous worldview isn't tested anymore. And how are we going to get there? That's reconciliation. But what is decolonization? Gracie, my great-great-grandma, when she was living here on this land in 1874, she had a beautiful Indigenous worldview. She had affirmation of love, physical touch, quality time, the gift to serve. She had a strong vertical lineage. Her great-great-great-granddaughter, my daughter Callie, should walk the same land as her great-great-great-grandmother did, with that same affirmation of love, physical touch, quality time, the gift to serve, while her Indigenous worldview isn't tested. But this is the beautiful benefit of sharing this land today through treaty, is Callie also gets to thrive and live in the Western worldview. Decolonization doesn't mean Indigenous people all want to move back to 1874 times. No. My great-great-grandma Gracie, she went to the hunting society to get her supply of food. Today, Callie and I do our hunting at Costco. We've adapted. Indigenous people love the Western worldview today. But the challenge we face is we still feel our Indigenous worldview is still somewhat oppressed today. That's the challenge that many face today. Decolonization means that at one time, there was no children in care. Everybody had a purpose, everybody had a duty. And that model worked. Indigenous people had a beautiful model. A model of social, a model of economics, a model of spiritual/religion, a model of everything. Today in 2023, we just have to understand we all live in two worldviews today. As Indigenous people, we live in our Indigenous worldview, but we also live in the Western worldview. And we can walk in both worlds. As Canadians, your missed opportunity for 5 generations is that you are missing in this land the beautiful Indigenous worldview that you need in your life as well. And you can step 2 feet in that Indigenous worldview. But when you're in there, don't come with preconceptions. Don't come with, I think I know. Just go in there and put 2 feet down and say, I have a lot to learn here, and I want to make sure that we get it right this time. Once your 2 feet are planted, you're probably going to get a nickname. Indigenous people, one of our foundations is humor. And when you get a nickname, that means you're super liked in there. Just remember that. But there's so much that you could learn in there that help you in your own personal lives, but also understand how we're going to make this better for both of us. Indigenous nations need full jurisdiction to child welfare reform. That's what we need. We can't do it with just operational jurisdiction anymore. But one of the things we got to understand is when you're in that Indigenous worldview canoe, just remember we all inherited a history. Sometimes today, as Indigenous people, we've kind of become our own worst enemy to each other. But remember, we don't want pity. We don't want anybody to feel sorry for us. But because of 5-6 generations of oppression and loss of vertical lineage, we've kind of created our own scenarios today as well. And as non-Indigenous people, remember when you're in that canoe, don't focus on that part. We're healing. We're getting stronger. Right now, our leadership manages poverty 75% of the time, and they have 25% innovation. And we're getting stronger in our canoes, but we just have a little bit of loss of control. Don't compare Muscadet to Cowessess and Cowessess to Cowessess. Every nation is on a different healing journey right now, and we just must understand and respect that we all inherited this moment. When you're in that canoe, you may see a little loss of control in governance. But remember, governance is foundational and it's getting stronger. You may see a little loss of control in social. Social's a real tough one right now. There's many social challenges. You know, what happened in James Smith a little over a year ago? That could potentially happen in many nations today. Because of the unmarked graves, because of the pandemic, a lot of that has triggered Indigenous people a little differently. And we're just trying to figure this out together. And as allies, you're the breath of fresh air. You're the ones that are not going to come in preconceived with your information or your ignorance of the truth anymore. Because this is where we have to reset child welfare from our attitude. It's not about approving the next chief or the next premier or the next prime minister. It's about us as Canadians and Indigenous people resetting our attitudes and resetting our foundation to what this country should be today, not how it has been oppressive to one side since day one. Every nation is going to have a different, unique model to child welfare reform. Some may do it on their own. Some may amalgamate and do it together. But we don't judge. Every one of them have their own model of care healing. And this is where Bill C-92 comes in. One of the things in the canoes is how we are going to help nudge each other, legislation-wise. Bill C-92, now the act, still call it Bill C-92, but it's an act. It's the First Nation, Métis and Inuit Child and Family Services Act. But I say Bill C-92 because it rolls off the tongue a little easier. Bill C-92 is in the Western worldview canoe. It's in the Western worldview legislation, so that when any province or territory wants to exercise number 92 of our Canadian Constitution and state Cowessess doesn't have jurisdiction, we do. Bill C-92 is a wall protector in the Western worldview, saying, nope, Bill C-92 is a law, and any province or territory cannot go in that canoe anymore. It's a protection law. Right now, there's a case at the Supreme Court of Canada. The province of Quebec challenged Bill C-92. And I talked to the leads in Quebec at the time when I was a chief. And they assured me, they're saying, we're not disagreeing that you as a nation should have your own child welfare. We're disagreeing that us as Quebec, we're sovereign as well. And so there's a sovereignty flex right now. And what my response to them is, well, just remember, ours are inherent to this land. And Bill C-92 is allowing us to build it without you interfering in our canoe. So your fight is in that canoe. And I'm a very strong believer that this case that's going to be told pretty soon, it's going to fall in favor of Indigenous nations. And this case is really foundational to our long-term relationship, because when the Quebec Supreme Court rendered their decision in favor of C-92, they put in there in one of the clauses that Indigenous people have an inherent right to do this. As the first time that a law in this country affirmed that. And when this wins at our Supreme Court of Canada, it's going to change our relationship for the better. Even things like C-15, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This is in the Canadian Western canoe that holds accountable to all Section 91 and 92. We got to change our laws to better respect Indigenous nations. Where I'm going with this is all these bills, they're not in the Indigenous worldview canoe. We have our laws. It's up to us as Indigenous nations to now write them down. Section 35 of our Constitution is in the Canadian Western worldview canoe. Some call it an empty box. It's there because when Indigenous nations assert their laws, Canada then inserts it into Section 35, and it's the fiduciary obligation to protect and fund that law now. That's when Cowessess created the Mio Pima Tisawin Act, our law. We inserted it into Section 90, into Section 35. And we told Canada, now fiduciarily fund us now. And they do. When we tell them, awas though, get out of our canoe. And they awas. You know, the biggest challenge, I'm going to start to conclude because hopefully there's a question or two. The biggest challenge through all this was getting two governments to come to the table. When I was chair of this right through in this creation, we had the provincial, and I'm going to get partisan here, we had the provincial SAS party, and we had the federal Liberals and us. And I could just sense the lip pointing back and forth once in a while. And you know, every time we would start to steer that way, I would remind both of them in the room, you're both sitting here for the duty of care to Cowessess First Nation. Leave your partisan out of this meeting. There was one meeting where we were talking about the fiduciary funding, and the province said, well, we're not funding this. You're a federal responsibility. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's going to take me 20 minutes to explain my story of canoes to you, I was thinking. And then the federal government said, no, you were a part of this when you created Why There's Cowessess Children in Care, so you have a fiduciary responsibility as well. And so we're sitting there. So finally, and I was always a butterfly in these meetings, and I finally had to be a bumblebee, and I said, listen, Cowessess doesn't care where this check is coming from. This isn't your canoe. This is you two. As long as the check gets to our canoe, and we're leaving this meeting until you can figure it out. And we exited the meeting. My lip was kind of quivering too. I was like, oh my gosh, I was never really that tough before. And next meeting, they said, Chief, we figured it out. And you know, and we have a fiduciary. So all I'm saying is when you do this, We will have hiccups. We will make mistakes. But at the end of the day, it's about understanding your duty of care. The duty of care is to our children. That's an Indigenous worldview. Our duty of care is not to pat down political bases and to try and I'm going to end with two things. When you create these models, do it from an Indigenous worldview perspective. The greatest warrior in an Indigenous worldview perspective is the one that brings peace. In Western worldview, the greatest warrior is the one that has a six-pack and goes into a battle with a spear ready to kill something. That's not Indigenous worldview warrior. Our warriors are women and men, and it's anybody that brings peace. That's an Indigenous worldview warrior. When we do jurisdiction, you must come from that attitude at all times. How do we know when we get there? I'm going to end with this, and I got two quick pictures, and I'm done. How do we know when we get there? How do we know when we get to the end goal? My little daughter, Callie, she's 7 years old today. In 2019, 2020, at the peak of the pandemic, Callie and I were playing outside on Cowessess, and there was a plane flying over the sky. And my little girl, she was 4 at the time. She was like, "Dad, what's that up there?" I said, "That's a plane, my love." At 4, she's going to ask why 4 or 5 times, because that's what 4-year-olds do. I said, "Honey, it's like a bus. There's a pilot, and she's driving it, and someone's handing out peanuts down the aisle." She's like, "Dad, can I drive one of those one day? Can I be a pilot bus driver?" I was like, "Oh, you want to be a pilot?" It's like, "Your mom and I will make sure you're a pilot." My wife and I are raising a 7-year-old pilot today. But this is what my wife and I inherited. Because my daughter is an Indigenous female, the toughest person to be in this country today, my wife and I have to try twice as hard to raise a little pilot when compared to other 7-year-old non-Indigenous females about to be a pilot. My wife and I accept the challenge. We're going to raise a little pilot, and we have to try twice as hard. But this is why this is so important to every one of us, and it's not just a September 30th or June 21st discussion. My hope is if Callie ever has a daughter in this land we share, I hope Callie doesn't have to try twice as hard to raise her daughter. She doesn't deserve that. That's why we must understand our relationship to get it right this time. Is reconciliation is delayed gratification. We may not see the results right away because remember, we're a tangible results society today, and they're usually on political terms of what we focus on. Reconciliation is one day at a time, and we have to get there together. I'm going to end off with just show you a picture of my mom and my dad, my wife and I. I'm going to end here. But here's a picture of my mom. It's her birthday today. And she was born in 49. I'm not going to say her age. You can do the math. But, I grew up with a family that had every right to raise me with a chip on my shoulder because they had every right to do that. But like many Indigenous people, we thrive on hope, that we just want a better life. And my parents did everything they could to make sure that, I could be a dreamer in this country. My wife and I raised 3 beautiful young human beings back on Cowessess. And it's amazing what our children have today. But our biggest challenge today is adults, is let's not stand in the way. We have to learn to pivot. We have to learn to pivot while keeping foundationally what we feel our values are. But remember, the pie isn't getting bigger. Jurisdiction is a shared responsibility. And right now that pie is very Canadian Western world based. We have to be able to massage in and pivot more Indigenous jurisdiction, and I guarantee you our ceiling will lift, that our children will one day tell us, "Thank you very much for adjusting. Thank you very much for listening." Yeah. Oh, am I monitored? Is there a question? There's 2 mics, or if you just have a loud voice, I can repeat it. See, you're like a real easy Cowessess band meeting here. Yeah, no, I'm just teasing. There's a hand up.
What do you think the implications are for calling back the doctrine of discovery?
Yeah.
A lot of people are asking, a lot of Indigenous nations are asking for that to be
Yeah.
appealed. What do you think the implications of that would be?
What do I think the implications are to the calling back of the doctrine of discovery, or rescinding it? Can I say rescinding? Is that your question? So, when the Pope came over a year ago, he didn't say it when he was on this land, but he said it on the plane ride back, that, we have to rescind the doctrine of discovery. The Pope said that. In the Western worldview canoe, that is really foundational because, the Pope is respected as, a tone setter, and has a lot of followers, just like how our political parties are. They have a tone to set, and so that's the beginning. But I find what is needed is our model in this country without Indigenous worldview is too big. It's too massive. Our institutions are so big and embedded with Western worldview. I think all this talk about doctrine of discovery is going to have challenges on adjusting institutions to that. But what we have to do is we just have to realize that, to take a approach that we can hybrid, that we have to all understand that as long as we don't welcome in Indigenous worldview laws that impact all of us, then we're just going to keep this and hand it off to the next generation to figure out. I'm going to use one country as an example, and I'm not praising them as the best country, but I want to talk about New Zealand and how they did this. New Zealand is a Commonwealth country, just like us. And in 1970s, instead of challenging the Maori, they started to adjust their house to welcome in more Maori laws and to more Maori traditions and customs. And today, New Zealand is one of the strongest economics in this country. I'm not in this world. I'm not saying because of our size difference, they have a different, but all I'm telling you is the mentality of rescinding doctrine of discovery. We just have to understand that our House of Commons and our provincial legislations, which have section 91 and 92, if they don't adjust, then doctrine of discovery is just going to be a word that's not going to happen, and we're just going to have a lot more challenges moving forward. I'll keep my words limited, but hopefully you got something out of that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
As a white settler, I always consider every child matters. I want to know how to respond.
Mm-hmm.
React. How does every child matter? What do we do?
Yeah. Thank you very much for just opening up and putting your shield down, and that's what we need to do. Remember, reconciliation can only come with uncomfortable conversations. And every child matters. Orange Shirt Day, Phyllis in BC, to every living witness. And I know there's a few in this room that have attended a residential school, are living witnesses. Every child matters means, different to each of us. But I'm just going to explain to you more of the foundational. Is that living witnesses are watching us right now. And when we wear orange shirts, and when we support and, stand in alliance with Orange Shirt Day or Every Child Matters, that's just the tone setting. But actually showing action, because every child matters. We talk about our children as Indigenous people, but even as Indigenous adults, it's the foundation that we think 7 generations ahead. And that's where the every child matters. Today we got things like, children, Indigenous children they're so optimistic. If you ever sit with a little wee Indigenous child in kindergarten or nursery or grade, they're so funny and so like, but when you get to grade 7 to 10, you start to realize that being an Indigenous person is a little more tougher in this country. When you start to realize that that beautiful caramel colored skin actually means something unique in this country. And by the time you become an adult, it's hard to be a dreamer when you're just understand. So every child matter, to me, when I see it, I love it. I see the shirts, I see the quotes, I see the everybody standing and wanting better, but it's about implementing now. It's no more just showing it, but do something about it. Do something in your personal life, in your social life, in your political life to do it better. And, I can go on and on, but, if you ask that question to 6 Indigenous people, we would all have a different answer. But the thing is living witnesses are watching right now. And let's just make sure we do them a little solid in their healing. And listen, we're moving forward, and let's have these tough, uncomfortable conversations.
Right.
I taught an art class at an Indigenous culture camp this year, and what I recognized was the sophistication that kids are kind of bored, like they were kind of bored, even with what I was presenting to them, so I had to change up my whole plan. That they're definitely different.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a good difference.
It is.
And it's a sophistication. And I just see it. I see it right here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. If I can I know we're done for time, but I was in the mall on October 3rd. And because Orange Shirt Day was on a Saturday, I was in the mall on the 3rd. And there's these four non-Indigenous teenagers, and one of them had an orange shirt on, and I had an orange shirt on. And 3 of them were like new Canadians. You could just tell that they were not here for generations, and trying not to sound judgmental or anything. But I told him, nice shirt. I told him when I walked by him, and he says, yes, I'm learning so much about the importance of wearing this shirt. I'm like, man, that generation's gonna be so good when they get older. So, it is adjusting.
Right, thank you all for your questions. Unfortunately, we're going to have to pause it there. Cadmus, thank you so much for your speech. It was incredible. We all learned so much. Really appreciate it. One of our students.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
One of our students, Hannah Bouvier, has a small gift for you.
On behalf of the College of Law and the students here and the Law Students Association and the Indigenous Law Students Association, I want to thank you for coming today and sharing about your Indigenous worldview. And thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you very much.